In her book, The Hidden Link Between Vision and Learning, Wendy Beth Rosen cites a study by Ohio State University. That research study found that 69% of students with IEPs were identified as having treatable vision problems, yet they would pass a typical school screening. Hello, I'm Dr. Karen Wilson, and I'm happy to have you here today. And I'm equally excited to have Dr. Juanita Collier with me here today to discuss vision-related learning difficulties. Dr. Collier is a leading behavioral optometrist and the founder of 4D Vision Gym. She specializes in post-concussion care, vision-related learning difficulties, visual rehabilitation, and visual development for patients of all ages. She is one of only a few optometrists in Connecticut to have earned fellowship status by the International Examination and Certification Board of the College of Optometrists in Vision Development. And she is here with us today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Dr. Collier. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to have you here. You know, one thing I started mentioning to you before we hit record was that a parent actually forwarded me your information and said that I had to speak with you. And this was a parent who had been searching for information about why her child was struggling. Her child had been diagnosed with ADHD, was an early reader, but they just could not figure out why he refused to read, hated school. Her friend had suggested to get her son's vision checked. She said, no, really dismissed it, saying he's got 20/20 vision. And it turns out that there was a visual processing issue that had not been identified. And that's why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because I think that, you know, so many people think once you do that vision exam in the pediatrician's office and it shows 20/20 vision, that all is clear. But according to the College of Optometrists and Vision Development, 10% of children have a vision impairment enough that is significant enough to impact learning.
Exactly.
And so I wanted you to walk us through why looking at vision is important and what a vision assessment looks like. Let's start there.
Okay. And I think that that's a really great point to kind of introduce this subject, because a lot of people equate vision with eyesight. And their eyesight's a piece of vision, but vision's so much more than that. And so vision is really how you're taking in anything through your visual system. So it's really how you're reading situations. It's how you're telling how far something is away from you, so your depth perception. It's how well your two eyes are working together. And then how your brain is making sense of all of that information once it comes into your visual system, so that then you can make a decision based on what you've seen. So when we're just looking at eyesight, usually that's unfortunately just for distance anyway, and most of learning is happening up close. And so we really want to take a look at kind of everything that's happening with a child's visual system and really focus on their visual skills for near.
And so it seems that if you only look at distance learning, which is typically what is measured, that you're really missing out on important visual processing information that's really important for, again, like you were saying, for learning in kids in the classroom. And for example, how eyes might be coordinated, like you mentioned depth perception, but what are we looking at and what are we assessing when we're looking at a vision exam that goes beyond eyesight for distance?
Yeah. So a big part of the exam takes place up close. So we want to see how clearly that child can see for near, because it's not standard of care to check near vision until you're 40 years old. So you start to things start to get blurry for up close. You're noticing you need the reading glasses and that sort of thing. But you usually don't check near vision for a child. However, we're also asking them to read, and we're asking them to learn how to read. So when they're looking up close, we see a lot of kids who are seeing like 20/80, 2100, 2200 for near, and they had no reason to report near being blurry because it's how they've always seen. So kiddos report or people in general will report a change in something. But if there wasn't a change, there's nothing to report. So an adult can say, oh, now things up close are blurry because they were clear previously. For a child, if it's been blurry the entire time, it's just still blurry. And Johnny next to me is running through these pages and he's just reading like a champ and I'm not. So what does that mean about me?
And that's really an important piece because kids are not going to report something that they don't interpret as being unusual. Like you're saying, if they've always been reading this way and always seeing this way, then they may not know that something is wrong. And parents will just see the behavioral issues. I'm too tired. My eyes are tired. Like this parent was saying, I don't want to read. I don't like school. And there may be another underlying issue that they're missing.
And that's why it's so important, like with what you do and really having kiddos understand advocating for themselves, because some kids will notice that there's a change, but they're too embarrassed to say it because it's like that means something's wrong with them. And we don't want them to think that. So one of my son's friends, he told his mom when he was 5 years old that he started seeing double when he was reading. And she was like, is he making that up? But she's like, Juanita, let me just check with you, so that I'm covering all my bases. And we had a long discussion about it. And, I was like, no, he needs to have an eye exam. And he did see double when he was reading. But it took so long for them to get there because she told her husband what he said. And he was like, oh, you mean after he reads like a couple pages, things turn double? And she was like, yeah. And he's like, well, that's normal. That happens to me too. It's like, nope, that's not normal.
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of parents have the same exact thing, but they've just kind of dealt with it their whole lives. And, this child at 5 years old advocated for himself. And now he's fully, seeing singly when he's reading and he's excelling academically. But that was something that he learned that he needed to stand up for himself and say, hey, something's not right, which is something that's so important for us to teach all of our kiddos.
Absolutely. I think that self-advocacy piece is so important because that's how students let people know that, things are going well or that something is wrong or this is hard for me so that they can then get the support that they need.
Exactly.
In the classroom or outside the classroom. Right?
Yeah. And for parents, if your child is walking differently or speaking differently, you can hear that. But how you see is so individual and so personal that no one knows how you see until maybe they start squinting when they're looking at the television or something like that. But other than that, you kind of feel like, oh, they must be seeing well because they can see, a bike down the street, or they can, they know when dad's coming home and all of those things. So they can see those things, but that doesn't mean that they have good vision.
Right. And it's interesting how you mentioned, the parent saying, that's how I see as well, or that's my experience as well, and not seeing it as unusual. And I see that with kids and parents who have dyslexia as well. Reading was always hard for me. And it seems that, this kind of assessment you do, it should be the first step before you even consider a dyslexia diagnosis, because you have to, if there is a visual processing issue, you want to be able to identify it and then address it. Not that two things can't be true at the same time. You can have visual processing issues and dyslexia. How do you distinguish if parents bring kids to you first? What is a visual issue and then what is dyslexia?
Yeah. So for us, when we're doing a vision evaluation, we are going to look at all the quantitative data as far as, what's their eyesight for distance and near, what is their depth perception, how well can they maintain using their two eyes together, what's their endurance ability, what's their stamina, and also we want to see how well they can make and keep things clear for up close. So that's kind of, just the muscular functioning of it all. And oftentimes we'll see that they have a lot of difficulties there. Then we'll also see, okay, once they do see something, how much information do they need in order to complete a picture? How much information do they need in order to memorize, 4 simple figures, things like that, because it's all just how they're taking in that visual information. So we'll present targets for 5 seconds, take them away, and have them say, what they saw and that sort of thing, because that's all your visual memory piece. Now, with dyslexia being a temporal lobe processing disorder, that we're going to see some memory things come up in that area as well. But for our vision exam, we're seeing how they process space and how they're processing more of the parietal lobe information as well. So if we're seeing that there's difficulties in the parietal lobe, more difficulties in the parietal lobe than the temporal lobe, we're thinking it's more of a vision issue. And then if we're seeing that both are completely, down, then we know that vision's being processed inefficiently in both lobes. But then we'll take away the vision issue, and then we'll see what's left over for dyslexia and intervention that way, because it's a lot harder to treat dyslexia with your modifications if vision isn't working appropriately.
Absolutely. And that is also interesting because it might be if the dyslexia is identified first and vision has never been checked, but it is also an issue that is unaddressed, that it may be a reason why kids are not responding to the intervention in the same way, because there could be a co-occurring visual processing issue.
Exactly. And they do tend to go together sometimes. So, we've had 20 and 30-year-olds come in and saying that, oh, my double vision's my dyslexia. It's like, no, that's not dyslexia, but it's like it kind of gets all in this basket together. Like, I have difficulties reading, so everything that is difficult with reading has to be my dyslexia. And we can make dyslexia so much more manageable if we take away your double vision, or the words looking like they're swimming on the page, or the words going in and out of focus when you're looking at them. Those things aren't dyslexia, So it's like, if we can make it clear when you're looking, then dyslexia is a lot easier to manage.
Right. And really what you're describing, the piece that you are addressing is really that visual processing piece. And I love how you talked about we think about vision, it's so much more than eyesight. And vision is actually processed, like you were saying, in the brain. It's in the occipital lobe and it's connected to the parietal lobe that you mentioned. And so it's more than just seeing. So students are taking in information visually. So that's the eyesight piece. But then they have to make sense of what they're seeing. And then they have to respond appropriately. And I think about academics, whether it's, explain what it is you just read or answer this question about what you just read. But it's not just academics. I have two kids who play sports, and it seems that visual processing is also going to be important. You think about when you mentioned depth perception for sports as well.
Exactly. So a lot of professional teams like baseball, basketball, and hockey have vision therapists on staff. So it's part of conditioning because, if you can pick up the spin on a ball, a half a second faster, or if your depth perception is just that much better, or you can see the game almost slowing down because you're able to take in so much information appropriately that it's like the time is almost stopping because you have so much time to make an appropriate decision. That's all how you're processing your visual information. And so they all have vision therapists on staff in order to, have that leg up on competition.
Right. And so once you do these assessments that sound very comprehensive in terms of what you do and very thorough, and for example, a visual processing issue is identified, we know that the brain is capable of reorganizing, growing new pathways in response to intervention. Vision therapy comes up a lot for parents, and I can't answer that question because I don't do what you do. What does vision therapy look like? How does it address the visual processing issues that might be identified? And I know that might be different depending on what it is that you find, but what does that look like for parents, or what could it look like for kids who are identified as having a visual processing issue?
So what we do at our office is we start from the basics. And so oftentimes what's happening is kiddos are being asked to read earlier than their visual systems can handle it. So technically, physiologically, developmentally, a child should not be able to read until they're 7.5 for an extended period of time. Their visual systems aren't strong enough for that. However, at least in Connecticut, we start reading at 4. So these kids are kind of like thrown into the fire, and it's really can you compensate appropriately or can you not? And their visual systems just aren't strong enough to do it. That's why most kids end up in distance classes in 3rd grade, because that's when you make that transition from learning to read to reading to learn. The system completely breaks down because they can't compensate anymore. So now they've made near vision clear at the expense of distance. And so that's why most people get their first pair of glasses at 8 years old. So what we do in our office is we go back to the beginning. So how should the visual system have developed? And so we're going to work on the tracking piece because that's very, very big for a lot of kids. A lot of kiddos are using like rulers or index cards to track. They'll have the highlighter reel where they can kind of see where they're supposed to be to stay on a line. If you need to do that to read, you're not tracking well enough to read. And so we're teaching them compensations immediately as opposed to training this skill. And so we go back to training the skill. Then when you're reading, you don't read every single letter. You kind of like jump, from one point in one word to the next point in the next word. And that's kind of why you can read those like jumbled sentences on Facebook and that sort of thing. And so what we're also teaching those kiddos is to land accurately. And so when their brains are going from one point in space to another point in space, their eyes aren't landing where they think they are. And so now that word looks different and it changes. And so they'll make up a word that kind of sounds like what it should be or like what makes sense in the sentence as opposed to the word that's actually there. And so we need to train the skill, but also the accuracy of that skill. Then we want them to be able to do it with that automaticity piece too, because if they're thinking about tracking when they're reading, they're not thinking about what they read. And so we start with tracking, then we go to making things clear. So we're really working that muscle flexibility. A lot of kiddos, especially the ones who didn't crawl, have a lot of difficulty increasing their focusing power for up close. And so when you're learning to crawl and you're kind of doing that like rocking back and forth motion, that's when your visual system's learning how to focus for distance and near and back again. And so if you didn't crawl, then that system's usually pretty underdeveloped. So we need to get that going appropriately as well. And now crawling's been taken out of the milestones for pediatricians, which means that parents kind of need to keep it in the back of their mind that that's something that we need to really focus on and make sure. Just because when you're going through those primitive reflex phases, there are so many things that need to be kind of worked through that now are being missed a bit more. And so it's a lot more on parents to kind of see what's going on and, the occupational therapists and everything to really keep their eyes on those sort of things. But we'll train that muscle and its ability and its flexibility. And then we go into the two eyes working together. So a child can track before they can use those two eyes together. And so we kind of want to go how that system normally develops. So then we'll work on the depth perception, we'll work on the endurance, we'll work on being able to understand when something's coming closer to you versus farther away from you and what that looks like, because we want them to be able to make everything make sense in space so that things are happening in real time as well. Then on top of that, we build up the processing piece. So we're going to work through the visual memory skills, the visual processing skills, the sequential memory, figure ground discrimination, like all of those I Spy games that we used to play when we were little. Those are great because you're really teaching that child the skill of figure ground discrimination. We play a lot of Guess Who in our office because that's an amazing game for visual discrimination. And all of these games that we used to play when we were little, and a lot of kiddos aren't doing those things anymore. And screen time is making a lot of things harder, and they're not having that full three-dimensional interaction with space. So then eye-hand coordination gets thrown off, and we're working more in flat surfaces, and it's all kind of melding together to be pretty messy at this point.
That is so interesting. There are a number of things that you mentioned that are really interesting, and one thing that kind of jumped out at me was the idea of teaching kids to read at such an early age. At a time when their visual system is not prepared to be reading, particularly for a sustained period of time. And I think about young readers when they're reading, learning to read kindergarten, how they are tracking. They're using their finger for every word across the page. And then as they get older, they're no longer doing that, even in first grade. So it sounds like that's an indication. Again, the visual system is not ready for that process of reading yet for
Exactly.
A 4-year-old kindergartner.
Mm-hmm. So once the system can handle tracking, you no longer need to use your finger. But if you're forcing them to track before their system can handle it, now they have to use their finger as a compensation.
Right. And so, when we think about kiddos, for example, who get missed, who, have always had this visual processing issue, is there obviously the younger they are, that's the optimal time to intervene because we know the brain is more plastic and more able to reorganize and grow these new pathways that I mentioned before. But, for a child, for example, who gets identified in middle school, is that too late? Does the intervention look different? Is it more intense? What can be done at that stage?
Yeah, so it used to be said that after 8 years old, you couldn't change anything. But we know the neuroplasticity of the brain, and the brain is plastic until forever. And so you can still make changes. It's harder to treat in that it's more work on the child's part at that age because we have to break down all of those compensations that they've relied on and build up new pathways where their visual system's working more efficiently. However, they're still in school needing to use those compensations because they don't have the new skills yet. And so it kind of gets a little bit hairy in the middle there. And so a lot of with our athletes, like we won't work with them during season because their skills just get so thrown off because now we're breaking this down and building this up. But if you work with them in off season, when they go back, then they're amazing. So, we've turned some of our patients into like switch hitters in baseball and everything by just giving them those visual skills. But you can't do that in season because you're messing things up. So it's better for parents of older kiddos to have vision therapy a bit more intense during the summer than during the school year.
Okay. Another thing that you mentioned, and we've been talking a lot about this, is kids spending more time on screens. And I have you here. Are we changing the way their visual systems process information because they're spending more time on screens than they are interacting in real life?
Yes, we are. And it's not giving their visual systems that ability to understand space appropriately. So when it comes to using two eyes together, it's easier on a screen to just use one eye. And so because there's no three-dimensional information. And so on a screen, they don't need to use the two eyes together really. And it's actually more work. But then you have them transferred to paper. And now they're supposed to be able to use that information without the backlighting kind of causing their muscles to work. So on a screen, because it's backlit, it causes your pupils to constrict. It causes the muscles that make things clear up close to work. But then when you switch to a black and white surface, now you don't have any external trigger. So the child needs to internally generate that. And that's going to be a lot harder for them to do because they don't have a need for that skill when they're on a screen. When things are moving so quickly when they're playing their games, that's how they can kind of try to figure out how far something is away from them. It's not actual real cues to depth. It's simulated cues to depth. So when they're in real space and they're trying to catch a ball or learn how to ride a bike, they don't really have that sort of experiential background that we had when we were younger. And so now they're learning from a two-dimensional environment and now needing to put their safety on the line. So that's why a lot of kiddos aren't wanting to ride bikes like we did. They're much more hesitant with ball sports than we were. They just don't have the ability to process that information because they don't have any experience with it.
That is so interesting. I'm in my mind, I'm going through all of these examples and I'm seeing, and this is making so much sense. In terms of kids academically, but also in sports, in terms of not developing in the same way and hitting a ball and catching a ball and throwing a ball and having kids I've seen kids who've never done that before in real life, right?
Yes.
And it also becomes easier for them to interact on a screen and to have those experiences on a screen, hitting a ball, playing basketball, playing soccer, and then in real life, they don't have that skill level to be able to manage.
Exactly. So if you remember the game Jacks that we used to play when you were little,
yes.
And it's you bounce the ball and then you pick those things
up. You have to pick them up.
Yep. So if you think of how many skills that takes, you need appropriate depth perception, timing, you need visual memory, you need so many skills there that are only able to be activated in a three-dimensional environment. And so when these kids are on a screen instead, they're not activating any of those skills. And so it's kind of a lot of guess and check is what they're doing. Whereas we actually needed to hone in on what these actual skills were with interacting with space. So then handwriting has been really, really tough for a lot of our patients, at least, where it's even getting the appropriate pencil grip is so much harder because they're not really needing to manipulate their hands in the way that we used to. And so as far as what the new generation looks like, I don't know, maybe those skills, or maybe they won't need the skills to, write in cursive. But, at some point we're losing the abilities that we used to have.
Oh my goodness. So we're losing the abilities. And then I'm also thinking about eye strain. There's been a lot of talk about eye strain and kids spending a lot of time on screens. What are your recommendations for kids who are spending more time on screens for homework, for video games, for for texting, for connecting with different learning platforms. Obviously managing screens is an issue, but from a visual, perspective and the strain perspective, what are you recommending for parents and teachers even?
So for adults will come in complaining of eye strain. I get headaches when I'm on the computer. I can't stay on the computer for that long. And adults will stop themselves. For kids, with the fun things like the video games and that sort of thing, a child's not going to stop themselves from something that they're enjoying. It doesn't matter if it's hurting them. And so they don't really have that ability to kind of self-regulate. But then when it comes to the demands that are put upon them for school, kids do want to please, so they're going to try to do what you're asking them to do, even if it's uncomfortable, which is why we have children who are seeing 2100 and still trying to read anyway, whereas an adult seeing 2100 wouldn't even attempt it. And so I think that to really kind of think of yourself and, how long can I be on my phone or on my computer before I need to take a break? And if that's what's happening for me with a fully developed visual system, maybe I should, cut that down significantly for my child whose visual system is still developing. And so I don't recommend children to be on the iPad, Chromebook, all of those things for more than 20 minutes at a time. And so the rule of thumb that we have is the 20-20-20 rule. So after every 20 minutes of near work, look 20 feet away for at least 20 seconds. And then for kids, I don't want that to go over an hour each day.
Okay. That's really great advice for parents.
Yes.
And easy to remember.
Okay.
So thank you for that. Dr. Collier, this has been such an important topic to discuss, particularly we're recording this at a time when kids are transitioning back to school or starting school for the first time. And again, because visual skills, the visual skills you have today are skills that are important not only for academics, but for daily functioning and all of the things that we do. So it's so important for parents who may not have thought about this in their back to school checklist, who might be thinking, oh my goodness, I should have had that checked. Or, before, even if they see their kids are struggling, might want to have that checked. And so it seems like now, even though school has just started, it's not too late to go ahead and schedule an eye exam because it's never too late to intervene.
Exactly. And then the other thing to keep in mind too with our middle school and high school students is concussions. And so after a concussion, visual processing gets hit pretty hard. And a lot of kiddos don't know how to really verbalize that, but they'll know that they have that foggy feeling. They know that they can't focus on their schoolwork as long as they used to be able to, but their vision might be clear. So a lot of them will have depth perception difficulties or double vision or having difficulties with their visual memory pieces. And it's very, very hard to figure out what's going on because they didn't have problems before. They just know that things aren't right now. And that's pretty much the extent of what they can say. So I think that definitely making sure that with your adolescent athletes, making sure that they're having regular visual evaluations with a behavioral optometrist who's going to look for all of those things, because even if it's been a mild concussion and they don't even think anything of it, something might have happened that we can correct a lot easier the sooner we are to the incident.
That's really important to know. Again, like you said, as we're thinking about this transition back to school for middle schoolers, for high school students who are playing those high impact sports and thinking about concussions, that's a really important piece to think about as well. So thank you for adding that information. Now, if our listeners want to connect with you, I know they're going to, and they want to learn more about visual processing, visual, examinations and treatment, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah. So for people who are outside of Connecticut, you can find us at 4D builttoread.com. And that's our main home program that really prepares the visual system for academic success. So it's a 12-week program where the parents essentially train as like a junior vision therapist, and they work on building all of those skills that I was talking about previously. So you can do that before there's a problem, or you can do that to correct a problem. But we aim that at the 6 to 9-year-old population, and it's worked wonders for our patients who can't get to us on a regular basis. If you are in Connecticut, then you can visit us at 4dvisiongym.com and come in for an exam. I look forward to meeting you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this. I appreciate your time, appreciate the information, and appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was great. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you being here. And be sure to check out Dr. Collier's information in the show notes. If you have enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you would leave us a 5-star review. It really helps other people find us and helps us better support families. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.